In the previous lectures, I analyzed how we should combat cognitive traps from the perspectives of control, mindfulness, and emotional intelligence. In this lecture, I will talk to you about a very important concept in psychology, self-esteem. I will share with you the significance of high self-esteem for success and the pitfalls of overprotecting our self-esteem. There is a popular saying in online language that poverty limits our imagination. Behind this slightly humorous remark lies a difficult truth. In psychological and cognitive tests involving intelligence, language, self-control, and other aspects, children from poor families perform lower than the average for their age group. A Columbia University research team analyzed the brain structure of more than 1,000 children and adolescents in the United States. The psychologists found that children whose annual household income was less than $25,000 had a 6% smaller brain surface area than children whose annual household income was $150,000 or more. This difference mainly affects brain regions responsible for memory, language processing, impulse control, and self-regulation, which are all important functions. Therefore, poverty not only limits our imagination but also damages it. What's worse, poverty also damages our mental health. A large amount of psychological research shows that poverty is the main source of stress, such as economic pressure, academic pressure, social pressure, and pressure from secular values. These sources of stress can lead to anxiety, inferiority, closed-mindedness, depression, and even guilt. Therefore, children from poor families have a harder time graduating from high school, being admitted to college, obtaining degrees, earning lower salaries, and are more likely to be unemployed. This creates a vicious cycle of poverty that ultimately leads to social stratification. How can we break the vicious cycle of the poor stay poor? Can self-esteem become a defense mechanism against poverty? Are children who have emerged from poverty successful because of their high self-esteem? My laboratory once conducted a study to verify the role of self-esteem. We divided college students from Beijing Normal University into 4 categories: those from wealthy families with high and low self-esteem, and those from poor families with high and low self-esteem. We scanned their brain structures, especially the hippocampus, a core organ located deep in the brain that is responsible for learning, memory, and stress management. First, we found that the average hippocampal volume of college students from poor families was significantly smaller than that of college students from wealthy families. This result is consistent with previous psychological research and confirms that poverty not only makes our material environment scarce, but also affects our brain structure and function. However, another result of this study showed us a glimmer of hope for breaking the curse of poverty. We found that college students from poor families with high self-esteem had an average hippocampal volume that was not significantly different from that of college students from wealthy families. This study tells us a very important point: self-esteem can establish an unbreakable defense line between the sources of stress brought about by poverty and the human psychological world, helping people break the vicious cycle of poverty. Self-esteem is an important asset for us humans, which we call psychological capital. How many buildings, deposits, and investments you have at home are all material capital. The level of material capital determines whether we are rich or poor in the material world. The level of psychological capital determines whether our psychological world is rich or poor, whether it is rich and fulfilling or dull and unhappy. So, should we improve our self-esteem? Since self-esteem is so important, how can we improve it? William James, the founder of modern psychology and a professor of psychology at Harvard University, said that self-esteem equals success/ambition, which means that self-esteem depends not only on success itself, but also on your expectations of success. Increasing success and lowering ambition, or lowering expectations of success, can help you achieve high self-esteem. When you hear lowering ambition, you may feel uncomfortable because people are supposed to have great ambitions. However, what I want to say here is that the vast majority of us have unrealistic expectations of our abilities. We often think that our abilities are higher than the average person's, but this is not the case. For example, if I ask you how good you are at driving, are you above or below average? I know your answer is above average. Interestingly, almost everyone answers this way. However, it is impossible for everyone's level to be above average. On average, some people are above average, and some people are below average. Not only in driving skills, but when asked other questions, the answers you get are similar. For example, most people say that their intelligence is higher than the average level, most businessmen say that they are more competitive than their competitors, and most football players say that their contribution exceeds the average level of the team. Why does this happen? Why do we always have unrealistic expectations of our abilities? This is related to our self-protective mechanism for self-esteem. Most of the time, we are carefully protecting our self-esteem. On the one hand, we actively pursue positive feedback, and on the other hand, we actively avoid negative feedback from others. In an experiment, psychologists selected two groups of college students. They told one group that the longer they could endure the icy water, the better their heart was. The other group was told that the shorter they could endure the cold water, the better their heart was. The results showed that those who were told that enduring the cold water longer meant a healthier heart actually endured the cold water for a longer period of time. They endured the piercing cold in order to prove that they had a strong heart. This demonstrates how much people care about proving themselves to be good. Earlier, I mentioned that we also actively avoid negative feedback from others. Psychologists have conducted experiments where they had a person stare at themselves in a mirror or try to distinguish their own voice from a group of people's voices. The experiment found that if the tester had just received negative feedback, they would stare at themselves in the mirror for a shorter amount of time and have a harder time distinguishing their own voice from others. This shows that they pretend not to know themselves and use this distraction or avoidance method to maintain their self-esteem. Therefore, when we receive negative feedback, we may deliberately distract ourselves in order to counteract the impact of negative feedback. I call this method of maintaining self-esteem the distraction method. There is another method we often use to avoid negative feedback, called the compensation method. Compensation means to replace or compensate for something. You have probably heard the phrase, "Although I am ugly, I am gentle." This is a form of compensation, using a trait we are good at to replace or compensate for a trait we are not good at. In a psychological experiment, psychologists did two things. First, they pretended to test the tester's IQ and EQ. Second, they asked the tester what the key factor in predicting a happy marriage was. The results showed that those who were told that their EQ was low would say that EQ cannot predict a happy marriage, and that IQ is the key. Those who were told that their IQ was low would say that IQ cannot predict a happy marriage, and that EQ is the key. Do you understand? This means that those who think they have EQ will say that EQ is important for marriage. Those who think they have IQ will say that IQ is important for marriage. These testers are using the compensation method to emphasize the qualities they are good at as the important and useful qualities. Overcoming the Jonah complex and building self-esteem. Whether it is the distraction method or the compensation method, they are both methods we use to avoid failure and protect our self-esteem. However, if we look back at the self-esteem formula mentioned earlier, self-esteem equals success/aspiration. The most effective way to improve self-esteem is to achieve success. You may say that everyone wants to succeed. But psychological research has found that this is not really the case. Many people are actually afraid of success and will actively avoid great missions. Humanistic psychologist Maslow discovered this phenomenon. Maslow once asked his students, "Who among you will become a great leader?" The students just blushed, giggled, and squirmed uneasily. Maslow asked again, "Who among you plans to write a great psychology book?" The students usually stuttered and evaded the question. Finally, Maslow asked, "Don't you want to become a psychologist?" All the students answered yes. At this point, Maslow said, "Do you want to become an ordinary psychologist? What's the point of that? That's not self-realization." The students' shy and evasive attitude towards the question of "Do you want to succeed?" is what Maslow called the Jonah complex. Jonah is a prophet in the Old Testament who has always longed for God's mission to accomplish a great cause. However, when God gave him a glorious task, Jonah ran away and avoided the task. The Jonah complex refers to people's avoidance of success, rejection of greatness, and fear of growth. Maslow explained that we humans are not only afraid of failure, but also afraid of success. The reason we are afraid of success is that we are afraid that our self-esteem will be damaged. You may be afraid of the cold at high altitudes, and that success will cause jealousy among friends or family. You may be afraid that after success, you will be exposed to the spotlight and experience many embarrassments. You may also be afraid that the higher you climb, the harder you fall. You may also be afraid that success is just a flash in the pan, and glory is fleeting. In fact, it is this fear of success, the Jonah complex, that hinders us from achieving success and actually hinders us from achieving true high self-esteem. Maslow said, "If you always try to cover up your inherent brilliance, then your future will definitely be bleak." This is why we say that the biggest enemy to prevent a person from reaching the peak is not others, but yourself. In the story of the Old Testament, Jonah followed God's guidance, tapped into his potential, found the brilliance in his own humanity, and finally completed this great mission. After listening to this lecture, I hope you can reflect on whether you are overprotecting your self-esteem in your life and whether you have the Jonah complex. If your answer is yes, and you do have these problems, then you must make a change. In the next lecture, I will further explain why this change is crucial to your life and how you can break through yourself.